So, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, such a honor and pleasure to join this family of Singaporeans in Shanghai, in China. And I'm so glad to have this opportunity to play the role of a moderator for my great friend, Minister Yu. And I like to call him minister, because as you know, in China, once you are minister, you're always a minister. More than that, because indeed, you do have different type of ministers, statesmen versus politicians. And I regard George Yu as a statesman, not politician. That's the key difference. Statesman has a vision for the long-term and holistic interest of his country, his region, and mankind. So without much ado, the floor is yours, George.
This is a little too imposing a podium. You're kind of like peering from beyond the flowers. The reason why I'm here is not because I know much about the Singapore Business Association. In fact, I know almost nothing about it. But because an old colleague from the Armed Forces, Gui Peng Hong, invited me. And he contacted me, wanted to meet me in Singapore. I was busy. I said, what do you want? He says, can you speak in Shanghai? I said, agreed. Because Professor Zhang Weiwei has kindly invited me to spend 10 days in Shanghai as a visiting fellow of Fudan University. And Shanghai is always a great interest to me and will be very important for Singapore's future. So I thought if I spend a period of time here, I will learn a lot. And one must keep learning because everything is changing so rapidly in the world. Last week, I had lunch with the old Shanghai Vice Minister Gong Shui-ping, whom I first met 32 years ago. The first time I came to China as a minister on an official visit. I was Minister for Information and the Arts. I went to Beijing. My host was Minister Ai Zhisheng. And for some reason, I was very young then. I was 39 years old. So he accompanied me to Shanghai and later to Suzhou, which is very unusual for a Chinese minister to accompany a foreign guest to various places. In Shanghai, I met Gong Shui-ping, who was at the time the head of the television station, Shanghai Denshi Ji Zhang. And then he showed us the plan to build the Dongfang Mingzhu Ta, the Shanghai Tower. He produced the Hakka engineer, a short guy, pointy head from Meizhou, and showed us the plan for the project, which was quite scary, you know. He says, oh, there'll be all these globes, reminiscent of the Tang poem, 大珠小珠落一盘. Yeah. And then, a year later, when I came back, he brought me to the site to see the concrete being poured for the foundation. 3 days without interruption, because such was the size of the base of the foundation. And then 2 years later, again I came back. He hosted me to dinner at Heping Fang Dian and sat me next to the window so that I could see the tower, resplendent, changing colors like every 15 minutes. So later, I told a friend, I said, wow, isn't it amazing they change colors every 15 minutes? He told me he did it for you. It doesn't change that often. You are showing off. And he had every reason to show off. He had 10 major projects, including the Fortune Conference Center, which was built in 9 months, the library, the museum, the conservatory, the sports stadium, and other things. And during that period, around 94, I was interviewed by a local media. And I do not know what made me say this. I said, Shanghai will be the greatest city on earth. Looking back, it's a bit foolhardy to make a prediction like that. You know? And I asked myself, why did I say it? I think it's because at that time, I could sense a raw vitality. And in a leader like him, a sense of the city and its future. So every project was scaled large in anticipation of something very big. And they could only think like that because of Shanghai's history. I mean, it was the greatest city in Asia before the war. And it was only resuming its position. And to be the greatest city of the world's biggest economy one day, the plans, which were conceived of 30 years ago, befitted such a city and its destiny. And each time I come back to Shanghai, it's just amazing, the transformation of the city, not just of the city, but of the whole Yangtze River Delta. You know, Zhu Rongji, when he was party secretary, went to Singapore to propose Singapore's involvement. Lee Kuan Yew consulted Goh Keng Swee, who was at the time advisor to the State Council, and working closely with Goh Mok, the State Councillor, advised Lee Kuan Yew not to touch Putong because it seems too grandiose. And 2 years later, when we were working on the Suzhou project, and Singapore was deciding between Suzhou and Shantung, I remember being with Lee Kuan Yew when he met Zhu Rongji, at the time Vice Premier. And Zhu Rongji said, no, don't waste time, settle on Suzhou. But I knew that in his heart, he would have said, you could have done better in Putong. I'm very grateful to Professor Zhang Weiwei for giving me the opportunity to be here. Because I can always come here on my own, but to have the experience which I had in the last week was very special. And Professor Zhang is a public figure. Whenever I'm with him, strangers will come up to him and will want a picture with him. So I've quickly to move to the side in order not to spoil the picture. But the advantage of that is you're able to watch how they interacted with him. They want his autograph because it's not just the fact that he's very active in the social media. It's the fact that he's able to give a reflection of Chinese people to themselves, giving them a certain self-confidence. The Western media, let me use this metaphor from David Marshall. They'll look at China's face and they'll focus on the pimple. And they say, oh, how ugly it is. You know? David Marshall once said that of the British media. He says, for goodness sake, take a step back and look at the whole face. There's a bit of that in the Western media when they report on China. Of course, some of it is deliberate, financed by a big budget to denigrate China, because there is a strategy to keep China down. For a very simple reason, because China's growth is so remarkable, it threatens Western dominance in the world. And for the Americans, they fear that China will displace them as global hegemon. And this will continue. There'll be a trial of strength between the West and China, between America and China, for many years to come. Because they think that when China grows bigger and stronger, it will be like another Western imperial power competing with them for power and influence and wealth and prestige in the world. But China is not like that. No, the Chinese mentality is we're all homogeneous. We're over 92% Han. We prefer to be among Han people. When there's a crisis, the foreigners will quickly leave. The Chinese people will stay behind. They may complain, but they'll take it. They'll comply. And then we'll reopen up again, the foreigners will come back. So the mentality in China has always been defensive. That's why they're always building walls. I mean, even in the national anthem, Qilai, Qilai, they're always talking about building walls. And it's not just a simple wall. The Great Wall that we see today is a fossil. It's like seeing old dinosaur bones. But it was not bones which defended China. It was a dinosaur. In other words, the Great Wall was a comprehensive system of forward deployment, of intelligence gathering, of early warning, of defense in depth against repeated Chinese dynasties seen as mortal threats coming from the north and the west. Until today, the instinct here is to build walls. So there's a wall for everything. We know about immigration, there's a wall for capital markets, there's a wall for Hollywood movies, there's a wall for books, for the media, there's a biological wall. This is China. And because of this, even when it becomes very big, its instincts are defensive. And the country is so vast and so vertically integrated. There's almost a feeling that even the rest of the world will disappear, China can continue on its own. And to some extent, that's true. If it were China and ASEAN, I think it's a self-sustaining system, even without the rest of the world. And that's remarkable, because China and ASEAN are highly complementary. China is land, vast population, cold in winter, dry, not very much arable land, and aging. Southeast Asia is warm, plenty of water, is young. You can grow stuff everywhere in Southeast Asia. No one is going to die from hunger in Southeast Asia, because even if you do nothing, the fish is available from the sea, and you plant anything, it will grow. During Japanese wartime occupation, people live on tapioca. Maybe not the best of diet, but you'll still be alive. And most importantly, same time zone. I was told, Luckin Coffee, most popular product is latte with coconut milk. Because Chinese people can't take lactose, when you go to a toilet. So coconut milk is okay. So all of us now, when we go to order a cafe, many of us order latte with coconut milk, for which Luckin Coffee needs 10 million coconuts a day. You're not going to get those coconuts from Hainan or from Sichuan Panna, and even those coconuts are not very good. You get them from Southeast Asia. And as the population in China ages, they will love the beaches, the warm water, the balmy climate of the islands and peninsulas of Southeast Asia. So I was telling an Indonesian friend, if you have a fund to buy up small islands in Indonesia, I'm investing in that fund. Because one day, tens of millions of Chinese will want to go to those islands when it's so cold in China. And the integration is profound. China has never conquered Southeast Asia. Yes, it moved small border skirmishes, Vietnam and Myanmar during the Qianlong era. But and maybe during the Cultural Revolution when China was supporting communist parties in Southeast Asia. But otherwise, when Southeast Asian countries look at China, they look at it against its history. During Tang, you had Srivijaya. And the reason why the Cholas destroyed Srivijaya was because they were competing for the southern Song trade. Yuan invaded Java under Kublai Khan. But in the end, nothing happened because the king of Singosari, whom they wanted to punish, had already died. They went back, Majapahit arose. Majapahit depended on Chinese copper coin as his currency. Then you had the great Ming voyages. Until today, temples to Zheng He are to be found everywhere in Southeast Asia, honoring him as Sanbao Taijian. Even durian, they say, is his droppings, right? I mean, many of us have heard of this. And someone just told me the other day, I'm not sure how it's true, there's a festival in Southeast Asia called Zhuangye, Guangya, where the deity will be brought from Johor all the way to Aokang, put into a boat, out to sea, and burned. They do that in Bagasi Api-Api also, and many other places in Southeast Asia. And someone said, this festival is not found in China. It was to remember the admirals under Zheng He. Well, that's remarkable. Zheng He, 600 years ago. And he's still remembered. So there is a historical memory of China in Southeast Asia, which allows us a way to deal with rising China, to benefit from its market, but at the same time, to keep it at a certain distance through a certain formality. No one wants China to be an enemy in Southeast Asia. Not Vietnam, not Myanmar, not Thailand, nobody. But no one wants China to be too close either, because it's big. And if you're too close to China, you lose your freedom. So there is a deep instinct in Southeast Asia, how to balance the big powers. And the more our account with China grows, the more we want diversification. We talk about the Belt and Road. I tell my American friends, please don't ask us to choose. But you can be sure that along the Belt and Road, it could be Vietnam, it could be Kazakhstan, it could be Kyrgyzstan. The more they develop the links to China, I say the more they want America to be around. But if you ask them to choose me or China, you won't like the answer. But if you don't ask me that question, you're of course welcome. In other words, Americans and Europeans are free riders on the Belt and Road. They don't have to pay a cent. They will be welcome. China knows this. So when China deals with Southeast Asia, they always say, no, we don't ask for an exclusive relationship. Zhu Rongji himself said it. I was there in 2002 when we signed the framework agreement for the free trade arrangement between ASEAN and China. And China is always saying, we are happy with ASEAN in the driver's seat. Not because we're an F1 driver, We are like Mr. Magoo, we have thick lenses, our reflexes are not very good, and when we drive the car, we're a bit gong-gong. But we will not drive the car away in a direction that they don't want. China won't trust the US driving the car. The US won't trust China driving the car. India won't trust China driving the car either. But ASEAN, that's okay. Why? Because we don't threaten anybody. And we are friendly to everybody. So what we want is to benefit from China's growth, but at the same time, to keep all our relationships open. What does this mean? It means that when Singaporeans come to China, and more Singaporeans are coming to China for all kinds of things, we play a special role. Many of us are ethnic Chinese. If we are just Chinese, look, there are 1.4 billion Chinese. We have no role to play. We have a role to play because we are not completely Chinese. because we are Chinese plus. And therefore, have links to India, have links to Africa, to other places, to Australia, and therefore more valuable to China, and certainly more valuable to ourselves. So this is why a community like yours, or like ours in Shanghai, is very important, because Shanghai is a dragon's head for China. And in many ways, it gives us a glimpse of the future. You know, for city planning, the cities of the 20th century followed an American pattern. The cities of the 21st century will follow a Chinese pattern. Because here in China, they're experimenting with urban systems and networks which the world has never seen before. And it's exciting, it's dramatic. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Guangzhou. I visited Yihang. And so they give me a briefing about the electric vertical takeoff vehicle. It's like a flying car. So I volunteered immediately. They looked at me. They were not sure. They didn't want to ask, not to embarrass me. But they were surprised that I immediately wanted to take a ride. Now, I was from the Air Force. I used to buy helicopters. Helicopter, one engine, a bit risky. 2 engines, a little safer. The big rotor blade can auto-rotate so that you can land safely. I was never a pilot, but I took flights with our helicopter pilots before. And in Brunei, we were able to land on narrow shoulders on mountainsides, just through auto-rotation. But if something happens to the main rotor, too bad. If something happens to the tail rotor, too bad. But this little flying car has 16 rotor blades, 16 batteries, 3 independent flight control units. I told myself, yeah, it looks like a toy, you know, you move it, you'll shake. I said, nah, it's okay. So I volunteered immediately. And others in my delegation all had to volunteer too. I think they were a little afraid inside. So they brought me up 50 meters, and then they brought me down. Hey, I said, hey, I want to go take a look, you know, take pictures of Guangzhou from 50 meters up. They said, no air traffic approval. But after that, we talked to the regulators from CAAC. Very meow, very strict. They said, no, this is the only company whose flying car we approve for commercial purposes. They had an accident before, and they were impressed by the way they responded to the accident. We are going to find in China a different way of organizing human society, where there is no need, in every case, for talented people to enter the city, where they can work further away in beautiful communities, but at the same time be very well connected and be part of the world through 5G, 6G, through bullet trains, through maybe flying cars. This morning, I went to the new Huawei campus. You know, they're so discreet. Professor Zhang wanted us to take a group picture with the Huawei logo. We could not find a Huawei logo anywhere in the campus. I think they don't want Americans to know what they're doing. Of course, the Americans are monitoring it intensively. But it's just detail, no? Just keep low profile. Keep low profile. Show by your action, not by your words. It's a lovely campus. And the Shanghai government arranged for the Ditie to go all the way there. And within the campus, they have a little train. Ren Zhenfei wanted it to be a choo-choo train belching smoke. They said that's no good. So they have a Swiss train running on diesel. But I think they will replace it with an electric train, so it'll be quieter and cleaner. But I thought if I were a young person, I don't think I mind working there. You know, it's such a wonderful, inspiring environment. And all over China, they're developing new communities. And this will be very important. There was a time when they learned from Singapore. They still do episodically, but on a much lesser scale. But we have to learn from China. And in many ways, those of you who live here and who know China well, you have a responsibility to tell Singaporeans back home what is happening in China, what are China's mistakes, but more importantly, what are its achievements, and how we can also learn so that we don't slide backwards, but we stay up front. We have to be careful about the geopolitics. Everywhere in the world, every piece is moving. And many of us are worried, no? Geopolitics, how is it going to affect my company? How is it going to affect my business, my family, myself? Should I be here? Should I move out? Singapore's best bet is not to be clever and interpose ourselves. It's very dangerous, you know. Someone asked, should Singapore mediate between China and the US? No, that is foolhardy. That is very foolhardy. We should never even think about that. But of course, if they want Singapore's help, we should help. That's what we should do. It's like when Trump met Kim Jong-un in Singapore. I was told, I don't know whether it's true, that they agreed on Singapore before consulting Singapore. Because they know that Singapore will say yes. Of course we'll say yes. I was the first foreign minister to visit North Korea, and they always welcome me when I go there. They like Singapore, and they know that we're under pressure from the US to restrict the activities in Singapore. But when they have to meet, they meet in Singapore. In the same way, when Taiwan and mainland have their meetings, they meet in Singapore. That's the kind of role that we play. But we are better off being part of ASEAN. Because sometimes we have to make hard choices. And it's good to be able to hide behind ASEAN skirts, you know. They say, oh, this is an ASEAN position. And if all of us maintain that discipline, I think we'll be okay. You know, when Trump introduced his tariffs, there's a bit of disappointment that Vietnam immediately wanted to settle. With zero tariff, the US with zero tariff us. I thought it was a mistake for Vietnam to do that. You know, Vietnam's imports from China correlates Vietnam's export to the US, which means that Vietnam's export to the US has a high Chinese component. So the US is never going to zero tariff Vietnam because they're going after China. And they should have waited for the ASEAN leaders to consult each other first before responding, even though each of us will have to calculate in our own self-interest. But I think Vietnam has learned from this. We have to survive. And we survive by not taking sides, not sticking out unnecessarily. But of course, if we are pushed, we have to be firm. And I recall in Fudan University how when Michael Fay was sentenced for 6 strokes and Clinton demanded that we don't cane him, we still did. I mean, we reduced the number of strokes from 6 to 4. And Clinton kept Goh Chok Tong away from the White House for 3 years. He was angry. Although later when he visited Singapore, after he stepped down, at a dinner which I attended, he told Goh Chok Tong, you are right to cane that boy. Because when he went back, he called his father. And the father had to call the police. I did not know at that time that while our stocks in the US went down, our stocks in China shot up. I went to see relatives in Shantou. Everybody talked about it. And everybody said, Singapore 很棒. We dared to beat American backside. We did not seek the honor, you know. It was the last thing we wanted. We had to do it because we cannot be pushed around. If we had buckled into the Americans, then others would have lost respect for us. But it's better to be with ASEAN because everybody needs ASEAN. China wants ASEAN as a friend, and everybody else wants to be in ASEAN to benefit from our growth. So ASEAN is the first circle of diplomacy is very important. And I hope that in a great city like Shanghai, in addition to meeting just Singaporeans and Malaysians, we also network Indonesians and Thais and Vietnamese and so on, and try to maintain a certain ASEAN solidarity in all the cities of China. It's in our interest. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, George, for this inspiring speech, which I notice everyone enjoyed very much. And before I ask you a question, I want to compliment you again for your contribution to the agreement on free trade area between China and ASEAN. I read his memoir. He gave an anecdote which is very important, which explains a lot on today's topic, East Asia and Southeast Asia, China and ASEAN. That is, when China proposed this free trade agreement, at that time, the year 2000, ASEAN was more or less still pro-United States. So when China made this proposal, many ASEAN members were at shock. They could not believe that China could make this offer. And then George made a proposal to the Chinese government. He said, maybe we'll start with something simpler and easier. There's an early harvest, so that those especially weak members can really taste the fruits of this kind of possible agreement. And Zhurongji said, great idea, we accept. And 2 years later, when the two sides signed this agreement, Zhurongji made a very important and, in the end, very important remarks. He said, 10 years from now, if ASEAN feels this agreement is somehow a kind of imbalance in favor of China rather than ASEAN, we can renegotiate, or we can change and modify this agreement. So this is very well received. So that reminds me of, a very important relationship in the world today. One is ASEAN and China. The other is EU and United States. Both international regional organizations with a big power. And you may remember the Munich Security Conference issued a report for the world for last year. Yeah. It's called lose-lose. Yeah. And I made a comment, said, no, it's not accurate. It's a lose-lose for Europe. In Asia, it's a win-win. Because if you look at the size of ASEAN plus China, 2 billion people, 3 times of the population of Europe. Yet, over the past 4 decades, it's win-win. And one major reason is the anecdote he mentioned in his book. We signed this free trade agreement based on mutually acceptable conditions. And China, as a major power, respects ASEAN. We recognize, I said, economically, politically, security-wise, we respect ASEAN. And China is the country that first recognized ASEAN's neutrality, centrality, nuclear-free zone, and more. But if you look at the United States, it's totally different. It's closely associated with NATO's philosophy. Keep America in, keep Russia out, keep Germany down. Of course, with Donald Trump, things began to change a bit, but who knows what will happen. He's less predictable. So my question for George, for Minister Yu, is do you think, this relationship between ASEAN and China can be a model for EU and United States?
The EU is an inspiration to ASEAN. When I was trade minister, I had on my table the Treaty of Rome, which in 80 pages described the construction of the European Common Market. It was a simple document, easy to understand, almost inspiring. And at that time for us in ASEAN, pointed the way forward for the next few steps. But Europe became more and more complicated. Until today, the documents defining the EU, the Acquis Communautaire, will cover a whole room. And you need many PhDs to understand Europe today in detail. The danger when you have such a complicated construction is that Europeans don't understand the institutions. Even as a minister, it was not easy for me to understand European institutions. And unless ordinary people have an affection for institutions, they will become alienated from it. So there is today all over Europe a feeling that Brussels is oppressive. I mean, the British monarchy, for all its foibles, we understand what it is. It's obvious. It's almost touchable. And people like it. The British love their monarchy. I mean, they know their failings and so on, but it's okay. It's still their monarchy. But Brussels is amorphous, it's distant, it's mysterious, and not fully accountable. We don't want to be like that in ASEAN. So we decided from very early, the Treaty of Rome is good, but beyond that, we have to find our own way to the future. For example, in Europe, at every meeting, they vote. And there's bringsmanship up to the early hours of the morning on every issue. In ASEAN, we have about 1,000 meetings a year. We never vote. We never vote. We can vote, but we never vote. Why don't we vote? Because face matters in Southeast Asia. If I win this time round and you lose, next time round you get back at me. And then in the end, we are maneuvering against one another. What do? Say on an issue, one country is adamantly against. We show respect. So we'll talk about it, we'll say, let officials study it further, we form an eminent persons group, we refer it to another committee, and then we go round and round, gradually like water, eroding the hard corners. And after a while, social pressure accumulates, and people say, okay, let's compromise. Then we move on. So the river meanders, but it still goes downhill. That's ASEAN. So year by year, it seems frustratingly inefficient. But it's okay. We make progress. Most importantly, we have kept the peace in the region. And we know how to deal with China. China likes face. So when there's a visit by Xi Jinping, everybody rolls out the red carpet. In fact, Xi Jinping's most recent visit in Vietnam, the president went to the airport. In Kuala Lumpur, Anwar himself was at the airport. In Phnom Penh, the king himself was at the airport. And you remember in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping came, Lee Kuan Yew went to the airport. Because there's the emperor visiting. And there's a historical memory of China, when the sultans and kings of Southeast Asia went to Nanjing to pay tribute. It doesn't mean that they accept a position of subordination. There's a famous story in Sejarah Melayu, the Malay annals, about Malacca's good links with Nanjing, with Ming China, during Zheng He's voyages. This is Sejarah Melayu, which many of you might be familiar with. There's a famous episode there which describes why Malacca had good relations with Ming China. It's because the Chinese emperor was very sick, and the imperial physicians could not cure the emperor. So one of the emperor's advisors told him, you go to Malacca, send an envoy there, beg for the used bath water, foot bath water of the Sultan. bring it back to Nanjing, bathe in it, and you'll be cured. And the Ming Emperor sent an envoy. And the Sultan was kind enough to give him that used foot bath. And the emperor bathed in it, and he was cured. And since then, relations between China and Malacca were very good. Now, this is the mentality in Southeast Asia. Yeah, the emperor is coming, we'll be very nice, but we calculate in our own self-interest. And I always remind Chinese officials that don't be overly impressed by the hospitality you receive in Southeast Asia. It doesn't mean that everything is well. We behave differently when we deal with European leaders and American leaders because different cultures are involved. So there's this instinct in Southeast Asia to adjust ourselves to different foreigners who descend on our shores. That's part of our skill. So we cannot play a balancing role between the US and China. But Europe can. I go to Europe quite often, partly because there's growing interest in China, even though officially they're all anti-China. But people are sensing that it's not right. I tell my European friends, if Europe shifts its weight from one foot to the other, like someone doing Tai Chi, you can affect the balance. Let us say the US is bearing down on China and wants the Europeans to support them. There could be war. But if when that happens, the Europeans move a little bit more towards China, the US will have to restrain itself. In the same way, if China were unreasonable, Europe should shift weight a little to the other side. Then China will have to restrain itself. So on the global scale, ASEAN cannot tip it one way or the other, but Europe can. To me, European leaders can decide the great issue of war and peace in the world. It's a pity that over Ukraine, European leaders lost their sense of history, saw Russia as an enemy without trying to understand why Russia did what it did, went along with the Americans. Then when Trump changed US position, European leaders were left on the limb and now are scrambling to recenter themselves. I think a whole generation of European leaders will have to leave the stage and let a newer group come onto the stage to lead Europe forward. The pity in Europe is the weakness of leadership. While intellectually, they may know that they can carry weight in the world, politically it's very difficult. But I think those of us who are peacemakers in the world should encourage the Europeans to take a more autonomous position because it is in European interest and in the interest of the world. An example is Africa. American policy in Africa is a mostly negative agenda. So recently, the commander of the African Command, based in Stuttgart, it said the entire Sahel is a southern flank of NATO. The US wanted to remove Traoré from Burkina Faso, accusing him of using the gold for himself, when in fact he's using the gold for his own people. The American agenda in Africa now is to keep China out. But it's not possible. There must be 2, 3, 4 million Chinese in Africa now. They're building Africa's infrastructure. And this is good for Europe because what is Europe's greatest fear? That there'll be a flood of people entering Europe from across the Mediterranean. Remember, by 2050, 1 in 4 human beings will be African. By 2050, 40% of babies will be African. By 2050, 50% of babies will be Muslim. And most of the migrants going to Europe will be Muslims from North Africa. Why are they going to Europe? Because in country after country, nations were destabilized. In Libya, in Syria, Iraq. Europe's best strategy is to help them develop. Then there's no need for them to leave Africa and risk their lives. No, even this Pope the first thing he said was to recall Lampedusa, which was the first place Francis visited when he became Pope, to visit the Muslim refugees there. So really on Africa, there's every reason for China and Europe to work together. But the European mentality is still very American, which is to see Africa as a sphere of influence, as if Africa belongs to them. Africa doesn't belong to anybody, it belongs to Africans. But Europeans have a vested interest in working with Chinese to develop Africa and to make it work. And Black Americans want that too. But not everybody in America. So, yeah, so I think you need a leadership in Europe which thinks more independently and which can help shift the balance and create better conditions for peace in the world. But ASEAN can't do that.
And as you know, China leader Xi Jinping went to Moscow for official visit, attending this parade, whatever, ceremony for marking the 80th anniversary of anti-fascism. And I was giving an interview to American press, and they asked me, are you concerned with the Donald Trump's whatever, ganging up with Putin against China? This we call reverse Nixon. I said, not at all. I said, we, both Chinese leader and Russian leader, are statesmen, not politicians, not businessmen. They are not transactional. They think in long-term interests. And a good example is, thanks to these two big powers, both consider themselves as civilizational states. The key difference between a civilizational state and ordinary state is civilization state has deep culture and deep people. That's very important. In other words, in the eyes of most Chinese and Russians, Donald Trump, what we see, 没有文化, no culture. Indeed.
Mao Zedong used to say, treat the imperialists as paper tigers. But tactically, take them very seriously. Tactically. We have to take Trump very seriously tactically. Because he has power. And he's supported by large numbers of Americans. And he controls both houses of Congress. And what he does affects markets, affects business, affects our well-being. So we have to take Trump seriously. He has a very aggressive, dramatic way of negotiating. A former Korean minister told me that if he wants $2 from you, he will ask for 10. And he'll scream at you. So in the end, if you settle for 3 or 4, you are so relieved. He's so happy. Because he only wanted 2. So that's the way he negotiates. He imposes tariffs on everybody, and then watches how much he has softened you. And there's a sense of relief when he smiles, describing you as a friend, put his arm around you. There's a great wave of relief. Every leader who goes to the White House to see Trump, the media of that country, the people from that country all watch. Whether it's Japan, whether it's Canada, whether it's the UK, they all watch. Oh, luckily, he had a good meeting with Trump. That's how he negotiates. And to some extent, it is rational. Because if bullying helps you get a better outcome, and you can bully, bully! So he's waiting for China to kiss his ass. But of course, China refused to kiss his ass. My guess is that Trump needs an agreement. If by the midterms, he's not able to get Americans, his supporters, fired up again, he'll lose 1 or 2 houses. Now, by middle of next year, the campaigning would have begun, primaries and all that. So it's 1 year. So in fact, it's only a few months to have a deal with China. Because if there's no deal with China, inflation will go up. The US deficit, the attempt to cut it will be completely unrealistic. interest rates will be affected. Even the US dollar may be affected. So gold price has been going up, the 10-year rate has been going up. And Trump is pro-business, so all the time he's one eye on the market. If the market is too nervous, he becomes nervous. Although, whatever happens, he declares victory. Remember that. Whatever happens, he will declare victory. That's how he is. This is his history. So don't be surprised. But in the end, he's realistic. He wants a deal with China. But China said, I'm not calling you. If you want, you call me. So this is problematic because face is involved. My belief, I have no proof, is this. You know, Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, he went to see Trump, had dinner with Trump in Mar-a-Lago for his H20 chip. They had a good dinner. Trump said, okay, you can sell your H20 chips to China. Then 1 week later, he appeared in Beijing and met He Lifeng. And this time round, he removed his leather jacket and T-shirt and put on his tie and looking very Chinese, and had a conversation with He Lifeng. And it was a good meeting. I was wondering, it's very dangerous for Jensen Huang to go to Beijing. He'll be criticized back home. He was not criticized. My conclusion, speaking as a foreign policy wala, is that he was carrying a message. And He Lifeng passed back a message. So after that, 2 days later, Besson said, tariffs are not sustainable. And the stock market shot up. And then Trump said, we are talking to the Chinese. The Chinese got fed up. They said, you're playing with me. So they said, no, there's no such conversation. So the whole thing was all jammed up. So finally, because the US needs an agreement, so the meeting in Geneva took place. And after 1 hour, He Lifeng walked out, looking very unhappy. So again, they must have been playing around. And they must have been called back. And so we had an agreement which was mentioned this morning. Now, for the Chinese, well, it may hold, it may not hold. But their position is, if it holds, okay, we'll go forward. If it doesn't, so be it. Because in my last 1 week here, every person I met, ordinary Chinese, the mood is defiant. In other words, don't buckle, don't kneel. If there's no agreement, no agreement. When we were at EU yesterday, Professor Zhang, who is always doing social investigation and interviews people, all the shops that we met, for none of them was America a key factor. It's okay. We can sell to other parts of the world. I think the Americans know that. And they need an agreement. So I think something will happen, and they know that China is sensitive. And Besson will tell Trump, look, do you want an agreement or not? If you want an agreement, then we have to be more consistent. But Trump being Trump, expect a kind of a roller coaster ride. But my bet is that there'll be some kind of an agreement, good for a short while, at least. Then we'll see. Because if you're in China and Moscow, you'll say, well, whatever you negotiate is only good for another 1, 2, 3 years, and that's it. After that, you may have to negotiate again. So the hope that the Americans can drive a wedge between Russia and China, I don't believe that.
Great. We could continue this conversation, but we have to stop here. I open the floor to the audience.
You can raise any questions, and first identify yourself, then put your questions. Please, the lady, yeah.
Good evening, Mr. Yu and Professor Zhang. I'm Linda from Rajantan, Shanghai office. Actually, I have 2 questions. One is for Mr. Yu, one is for Professor Zhang. So we all know the recent conflict between India and Pakistan. So my question for Mr. Yu is, do you think the result of the recent conflict between India and Pakistan will affect the negotiations of the trade tariff agreement between ASEAN countries and the US?
I was surprised by how closely Chinese people followed the India-Pakistan conflict. I mean, they knew everything, the aeroplanes, the missiles, the AWACS, everything. And they were rooting for the Pakistanis because it's Chinese equipment and systems. Of course, it's difficult to know what really happened because you get all kinds of news coming through. But if you watch the market, Dassault shares went down, and Chinese, the company which makes the aeroplanes, what's the name of the company? Chengdu went up. So I think that reflected what happened. To me, it was a gamble by Modi. He thought after Pahalgam that if you were to give Pakistan the bloody nose, his political base in India would shoot up. But because the outcome was not that favorable to India, I think his political base has been affected. If you follow the social media in India, much of what has been reported in China in the last few days is coming out in India. And I think the views will change and there'll be a lot of recrimination. But I don't think it will affect ASEAN's negotiations with the US at all.
Okay, thank you. So my question for Professor Zhang is, someone said that the tariff war started by President Trump will accelerate Chinese mainland's taking over of Taiwan. Do you think so? Thank you.
And, I'm quite open about this issue of reunification. And I think the date is closer and closer. That's my own estimate. And because everything shows we are more or less ready. So I remember when China leader went to have this meeting with Biden last year, basically said, please support our peaceful unification. If you don't support, then there'll be other ways of negotiation. It could be, that's my words. It could be peaceful, it could be non-peaceful, it could be something between. So there are all kinds of ways and means. I'm very optimistic about this reunification, even for its future in the whole Asia-Pacific environment, including its relation with ASEAN, etc. During this tariff war, there was a cartoon showing Donald Trump and Chinese leader reading two books. Donald Trump was reading his Art of the Deal, and Chinese leader was reading Art of War. In other words, during the whole past year, when we meet with foreign delegations or give interviews, this question was always raised. What do you think of Donald Trump, and whether he will win or not, and who you like, Harris or Donald Trump? I always think Chinese like Trump a bit more for one reason: he provides a lot of fun. And in the end, I find that only Chinese can talk this way, very light-hearted. It's not a big case. We're not afraid of trade war. We're not afraid of tech war. We're not afraid of all this. We said this back in 7 years ago, openly through our show. And so this is the mentality. I think, it's far better for the Taiwan's leaders to realize, as you mentioned, the case of this Indian-Pakistani conflict as well. And we don't want to have this military solution, but this is something on the agenda. We have to achieve unification. This is for sure, 100%.
May I add my view to this? When Trump in his first administration received a congratulatory phone call from Taiwan, China protested strongly, and Trump's reply was beautiful. He said, well, I thought I was just talking to a customer. In other words, he was saying, my relationship with Taiwan is transactional. And it's quite clear that Trump in this administration also sees America's relationship as transactional. This Trump personally. Of course, there is the deep state in America, which views Taiwan in the most serious terms and wants to keep Taiwan separate from China for as long as possible, if possible for eternity, even though the US has a one-China policy. From the Taiwanese viewpoint, to prolong this period is bad because the clock is ticking against Taiwan. Taiwan's negotiating position weakens with time. this formulation, 不统不独不什么 the three no's, huh? In fact, you're losing time because the relative strength of China improves. Taiwanese would have followed what happened in the India-Pakistan conflict. They know that in any conflict over Taiwan, it's very difficult for the US to win because it's so close to the mainland. So China has the advantage of electronic coverage, of distance, of everything. And I don't think Taiwanese will fight for Taiwan the way Ukrainians have fought for Ukraine. So if I were Taiwan, and this was Lee Kuan Yew's view from the beginning, negotiate now. Better negotiate yesterday. What do you want? What you want is to preserve your autonomy so that Taiwan can remain special. Taiwan can produce a TSMC. TSMC is a complex phenomenon. Taiwan can produce a 瓷器. China can never produce a 瓷器. 瓷器 saved my son when we needed a bone marrow for his transplant. So Taiwan, by being separate, can in fact enhance and add to Chinese culture, Chinese civilization, and to China overall. And the earlier these negotiations take place, the more autonomy Taiwan will have. But if you wait till something happens at Hong Kong, and China has to move, and hundreds of maybe 1 million Taiwanese will leave Taiwan because they got foreign passports. You'll be a sullen Taiwan, which will be much less beneficial to China, and certainly much less valuable to Taiwanese. But in the end, can they prevent it? They can't prevent it. And they know they cannot prevent it. What China needs to do is to accept the fact that probably the majority of young Taiwanese don't want reunification. They're supporters of the DPP. And you have to win them over. Not everybody is dark green. There are those who are light green. And they can be won over. So I would hope that much more effort is made by the mainland to win over young Taiwanese.
Just add one recent piece of information. You may know the US Secretary of Defense, Hexas, said, indeed, in today's China has the military capacity to sink all 10 aircraft carriers within 20 minutes. And we have, United States has planned all these war scenarios. All of them, they failed if they clash with People's Liberation Army. And I said very openly in Malaysia, in Thailand, through interviews, I said, Chinese have a culture of face saving. We respect the United States. We still call you superpower. Yeah. But one day, if you impose a war on China, military clash over Taiwan or South China Sea, I hope this will never happen. I said, next day, in the eyes of the international community, United States will no longer be a superpower. That's my very frank comment. Early warning to the United States. Donald Trump understands.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Jason Ho, and I live in Suzhou. I come with the Singapore Chamber of Commerce, and I'm a big fan of Mr. George Yeo, whom I always known as BG Yeo when we were in the army way back then. And in Singapore's history, coming back, instead of talking about Trump, I would probably talk about our own country. Being that growing up in Singapore and living here for the last 15 to 18 years, Singapore is somewhat still like a bubble. And I say that coming from Singapore in my early times as well, having done the whole NS, OCS, everything as well. Our unique history, multicultural background, and of course somewhat abrupt independence that was thrown upon us, make us good candidates to experience a multipolar situation. Because in our founding times, I would say that Singapore was a little bit more multipolar before we became a nation on its own, led by, of course, our late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. But back then, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was very close with President Deng Xiaoping. Now, currently, what challenges do you find, BGO, that our current generation of leaders who never went through those tumultuous periods will have to overcome in this increasingly multipolar world? And what approach can you suggest with regards to our small little nation to navigate the giants of the world? Thank you.
Our vulnerabilities have not gone away. And when the big pieces are moving, there could be new openings, but the old openings might be shut. So we have to be very careful, very alert, and try to see as far ahead as we can. I don't think whoever governs Singapore has that much freedom of action. You can't take sides because that's suicidal. You need the region. You have to be hard on yourself. Something happens like COVID, you must have enough resources to get by. What can undo us is if we ourselves are fractured, if we turn inwards. And I'm very happy that in the last general elections, Lawrence Wong increased the popular vote by 5%. It was completely unexpected. I don't think the PAP expected it either. But somewhere in the course of the 9-day campaign, listening to Trump every day, Singaporeans decided, okay, let us see things in perspective and in proportion. We may have our unhappinesses and our complaints, but really our lives are at stake. And we need a united leadership. So I don't think the PAP will draw the wrong lessons from this and be complacent. If you listen to the ministers, they're all aware that it was not that comfortable at the beginning of the campaign, and they should draw the appropriate lessons for it. And so long as we stay united, whatever team governs Singapore, I think the landscape is quite clear. You don't have that much freedom. You have to spend more on your own people, but you can't overdo it. You may complain about COE, but in the end, we can't afford to have horrible traffic jams like in Beijing that will kill us. We can't take liberties with our neighbors. We want to invest in Johor and Batam Bintan, but we know that we are vulnerable. And that when policies change, we better have options. So I'm not that concerned about the governance of Singapore. In terms of external policy, the concern is always internal, whether we maintain a sufficient consensus to be able to react quickly to new situations.
And more questions? This gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Adi Harsono. I'm from Indonesia. So from the Indonesia Chamber in China. Okay. I flew in from Jakarta actually last night, just for this.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. I like the topics you talk about. I study physics. I know that space station is an ultimate technology. Nobody else can make the space station. Not finance, the technology, the material science, everything is there. Why don't we just create one single project? Let's say space station. Now I heard the news that Pakistan was chosen to be the foreign astronaut to be put in the Chinese space station. Why not from ASEAN?
Yes, I'm attracted to the idea of ASEAN-China cooperation in space, especially when the Rail Islands could provide a launch pad on the equator to give the rocket maximum initial velocity. You know, it's always better to launch from the equator. So in America, they go as far south as possible to Cape Canaveral. In China, they launch from Wenchang. In France, they launch in South America. We should launch from the equator on one of the islands in the Rails and make it an ASEAN-China facility and be part of this program we talked about. China's space program it's been remarkably successful, and we should be joining China on the moon, on Mars, and so on. And we can add our own value in different ways. The main problem between China and ASEAN is the South China Sea. On Taiwan, I think none of us wants to get involved. But on the South China Sea, I think Vietnam and China have worked out some arrangement. So the proximate issue is that between the Philippines and China. And today they're having elections in the Philippines, and China is a big issue. My estimation is whoever wins this election, whether it's Duterte or Marcos faction, the pendulum will stabilize. I told my Chinese friends when Duterte was president, I said, this pro-China policy of Duterte is not sustainable. I said, the Filipinos are in their hearts pro-American. They used to say, GI, go home, but take me with you. I don't think that feeling has changed. Most Filipinos want to be American. Ordinary Filipinos, because it's a passport to a much better life. But they don't want to be bullied by the Americans. And I think the pendulum will swing back. It will swing back. It's gone too far in the other direction. Especially when it's quite clear that if there's a conflict over the South China Sea, the Americans have got many other things to do. And therefore, there's a limit to what adventure the Philippines can involve itself in. And the Chinese must understand this and make it easier for the Philippines to climb down. So I'm not pessimistic. I think after today, things may get better. And the Americans will not want to fish in this water because they've got much bigger fish to go after. The key in the South China Sea is to create a positive agenda. And Indonesia's Natuna Island may well play a very important role. Imagine if Natuna Island, which belongs to Indonesia, and therefore not sensitive for all the other countries of ASEAN, become a tourism center, becomes a fishery center. And China has enormous need for fish and shellfish in Southeast Asia. And a center for search and rescue. Open it to China and to ASEAN. We may well be able to create over time a positive agenda for the South China Sea, which in terms of scale is like the Mediterranean Sea. The distance from Singapore to Manila is shorter than the distance from Barcelona to Istanbul. So if we make Natuna a center for ASEAN-China relations and work out a positive agenda, something may happen. There's no benefit in trying to quarrel over the claims. No one's going to give up his claim. Not the Philippines, not Indonesia, not China. Just set aside the claims and work for common benefit.
Great. And this gentleman, yes.
Hi, Prof. Zhang and Mr. Yeo. Thank you for taking the time off your busy schedules to come here. I'm Eugene I'm a first-year student in NTU. So there's 30 students who are coming over in August. Please send them over here. We will welcome them very warmly. The question I wanted to ask is that in some previous talks, Mr. Yeo shared about your affinity with Taoist philosophies about harmony and the cycles. And recently I read a book. It was about the fourth turning, how in American history, the history goes in cycles from renewal and crisis. So I was wondering how we can kind of apply that, if you agree with that principle, and how we can apply this in Singapore and China. Yeah, just wanted to hear your insights. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Just yesterday, Prof. Zhang and I were talking about Xi Jinping's philosophical underpinnings. I heard from somebody that when he was governor or party secretary of Fujian, Xi Jinping took an interest in the I Ching. I hope it's true. And if he had that interest then, I hope he continues to have that interest now. Because if you have an interest in the I Ching, you will not be arrogant. You will know that everything goes in cycles. And that if you think you are at your peak now, there's only one way, downhill. It's always better to be progressing, be learning, staying humble. And if a leader has that quality, he'll be a good leader. But a leader who thinks that he can turn the world around his finger, he will fail, and he will fail grandly. There are 64 hexagrams in the I Ching, and 63 of them all have at least one item which is negative, except for one. And that's hexagram for humility. So if you're humble, everything is good. If you stop being humble, the problems begin. So even though you may have a great victory, but it's over Trump or Chinese weapons in Pakistan or whatever, stay humble, because there's another round. And in that new round, it may be your turn.
Maybe one final question, given the time limit. One final, yeah. Okay, this lady, please.
Thank you, Yang Buzhang and Zhang Jiao. My name is Yolinda. I'm the Consul General of Fiji. I just would like to take the discussion perhaps outside East and Southeast Asia because I come from the Pacific and I want to visit a very important topic that we've been discussed and heard your insightful thoughts about this tariff trade war. Fiji been very small in the Pacific. In fact, most of our trading partners, we have trade deficits. But unfortunately, with the US, we had a trade surplus because we have a product that's very famous. It's Fiji water. Fiji water, even in China, you know about that product. Even President Trump, Bill Clinton, they drank Fiji water. And that company, in fact, is owned by an American company, but they just invest in Fiji. We have just a handful of products exporting to the US. So when it comes on the 2nd of April, when he announced this tariff war, it's not just against China, it's against the whole world. So I don't know how he calculated. We suddenly found ourselves in slap with 32% tariff. In fact, our applied average tariff was just 3%. So now, of course, he's demanding all the trading partners to negotiate deals. And Fiji being so small, we are not powerful politically or economically like China, the Europeans, or even ASEAN when you have a big group collectively. So, no, my finance minister, my trade minister have a big headache now. They have to negotiate a trade deal. So I'm just thinking, even if we get a final deal of 10% tariff, it just came from nowhere. That means we have the additional 10%, making our product more expensive to the US. Now, my question is, if the rest of the world, apart from those big ones that can really negotiate the US, at the end, accept what the US may be giving to us at 10% minimum. They said, we do you a favor, give 10% minimum. If we are to accept the kind of arrangement, then what is the future of the WTO? Because we know the WTO was set up after the Second World War for multilateralism and for the small countries to participate in global trade. So, that's a very important question to our policy makers back home. For a small country like Fiji, very small, we don't even have 1 million people, we have only 900,000 people, very small economy, and suddenly get caught in this kind of trade war. What would be your advice? And what then the WTO look like?
How much Fiji water do you export to America in terms of revenue?
America, in fact, is one of our biggest exporters.
How big is it in terms of money?
I don't know exactly in terms of volume, but they are the biggest buyer because it's their company and we export back to the American. So what I heard is about 20% of our total export.
To America?
Yes, Fiji water.
Well, if you are Panama, I think you have to queue up. If you are Fiji, if I were Fiji, I won't queue up because it cannot be that important to you to sell Fiji water to America. And if Trump drinks it and he has to pay more for it, that's not a bad thing. And I'm quite sure because your water is so superior, you should be able to develop markets elsewhere. So if Fiji were to have free trade agreements with ASEAN, with China, with India, with Europe, then you have alternative markets. But do not, on account of this one item, buckle. It's not good for you. But if you're Panama, you have no choice. So small countries like Singapore, sometimes you've got to stand firm. And if it's not that important, stand firm. If it's very important, well, it can't be helped.
I just make some additional comments on this issue of small countries vis-a-vis big powers. I fully understand, as George just talked about, being small, vulnerable. You have to be very cautious. You have to be friends with everyone. This is correct. Yeah. It reminds me of one remark made by Chairman Deng Xiaoping in the early 1990s, when China itself was also vulnerable, however big China was. He said we should be friends with everyone, with the United States, with the Soviet Union, with the developing country, etc. Then he said, in Chinese, he said, 但是我心中很清楚. everything. I'm very clear in my heart. Or to be more specific, who are your genuine friends, who are less genuine, who are not real friends. So this subtlety is in the Chinese culture. For instance, when Donald Trump applied sanctions, not sanctions, a tariff on all the countries, some countries have to unwillingly negotiate with this whatever, Donald Trump's policy on tariff. Yet in their heart, they are not happy at all. So that's very important. In the Chinese language and culture, we see Dao. This is about Dao. Yeah, we see 天下苦美久矣. Most countries suffer from U.S. behavior for so many decades. Maybe Singapore is exception, but most countries. 公道自在人心. How to translate this kind of truth and genuine feelings in the heart of the people. And in due course, it will reveal itself and shape a kind of irresistible trend of history. So I think this is what we call on the right of history. Furthermore, I made this comment when we had a discussion in Sciences Po in Paris. Same question, WTO, no, Donald Trump don't want it. So I said, so what? China alone, China is the largest trading partner for over 140 countries. We still embrace WTO principles. And now China become the champion for free trade. Maybe some countries have this kind of misgivings, that kind of misgivings about China. But on the whole, if you compare China and the United States, I was in South Africa, they have also complaints about China. But we say, look at history. If you have complaints, we say, let's sit down and talk about it and discuss whether we can find some mutually agreed solutions. Same with debt deferral, debt payment. We agree to talk with you. It's already very different from the United States. So I always say, perhaps with my slight Chinese bias, because of China, indeed, the world is different. I'll give you another example. If you look at the financial world, given the whatever financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, so many countries simply went broke. Yeah. But this time, only a small country called Sri Lanka went broke. Many other countries experienced difficulties, challenges, but not broke. The poor Argentina, yeah. Actually, it's very rich in terms of resources. Now it can come to China and borrow US dollars to pay its debts and pay back China with either its beef or Chinese currency, whatever. So there are far more leeway than ever before to cope with different situations and American hegemony. So even Zelensky can have a quarrel with Donald Trump in the White House. So the world is already different. Do we have a question from, maybe from you? Okay, thank you.
Firstly, I want to say thank you to Zhang Laoshi. This 中国三部曲 actually helped a lot of foreigners get to know more about China. And I will also want to share with my friends here. Of course, I want to get a signing later because a lot of things that you wrote back in 2008 to 2010, and a lot actually had given that vision over the last 2 decades. So thank you very much. And Zhang Laoshi has always been my 中国的偶像. But George, if I can call you now, George, is my 新加坡偶像. I know time is getting late, but actually I have one question to bring back to the Taiwan issue that both of you mentioned earlier, because I think I watched something that, George, you were in a very nice batik in the recent meeting in, I think was in Indonesia, and you were talking about unity among the ASEAN nation, but towards the end you give a comment that we should stay away from Taiwan. So I didn't get to watch the rest of it, I wasn't there in the meeting, but maybe can you elaborate a bit more And actually, in that aspect, I think there is also a concern at this moment, and also one of the key concerns maybe among all of us here that has been staying in China for a while. So if I can take that as the first question, sorry. The second question is, if we look at stabilizing ease with such a topic and looking at Singapore's current situation, I think we need a really good leader. And deep down from my heart, I served under you during the young PAP time when I was an NUS student. A lot of us are still a big fan of you. Even today, and just recently, I went to Singapore for the election. Some of us still miss you. I think ever since you left, we didn't see a better foreign minister. Honestly, deep down from my heart, will you be going back to lead our nation again, maybe, or participate in some way? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words. I'm too old to be to go back into public political life, but I'll do what I can in my own way, in my own little way. The question about Taiwan is simple. I don't think anyone in Southeast Asia really wants to get involved in the Taiwan issue. The only reason why Taiwan is separate is because of the US Navy. If the Korean War had not supervened and the Seventh Fleet had not sailed into the Straits of Taiwan, reunification would have happened a long time ago. One China was promised in the two conferences in Cairo, when Chiang Kai-shek was there, and reaffirmed in Potsdam after the war in Europe had ended. So the legality of one China is beyond doubt. It's that Americans who are trying to keep it separate for as long as possible because there are strategic reasons for keeping Taiwan separate as a unsinkable aircraft carrier. They dare not say that they support Taiwan independence because everything breaks down when that happens. So we do not want to get involved. The Filipinos right now play a little bit, but they'll find that they'll get less from China by playing this card.
Great. So thank you, George. Thank you all. And it's time to somehow conclude this wonderful session of roving discussions. And of course, I believe we'll have more opportunities for this kind of dialogues, and we'll ask George to come here again to speak to you. So thank you very much. Thank you.